Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this Wednesday's Insight ABSAD webinar. My name is James. I'm one of the clinical educators from the team here at Insight, based in Meadjin in Brisbane. I'd like to begin this morning, before we introduce our wonderful presenter and our topic for today, but I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands on which we're all meeting from across this state, and likely also those who are coming to us from other areas and other regions of Australia today, to acknowledge traditional owners and to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to extend that respect to any First Nations people who might be joining us in this Insight ABSAD webinar today. So yes, without too much further ado, I'd like to let you know that today we have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Samuel Brookfield, and also his recent research for which he obtained a PhD. Congratulations on that, Sam. That's no easy feat by any means, but he'll certainly tell you more about that because that's the focus of our presentation today. Sam is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Queensland here, and is also a registered nurse, and his focus has been on the ethnographic exploration of how people experience methamphetamine use and recovery. I'm very much looking forward to this because I often don't realize how many assumptions I have until I start to hear these types of research and the real in-depth exploration of people's voices and their stories. So thank you for bringing that. Just in terms of our management for things today, before Sam introduces himself, we will be taking any questions, queries, reflections from you through the chat today. So feel free to pop those in. And certainly if you, what we'll do then at the end is come together to spend some time collating those questions, putting them to Sam, and taking an opportunity for you to have different things addressed and spoken to and clarified as well. So without any further ado, Sam, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
All right, yes, thank you very much for the introduction, James, and thank you very much for having me here this morning. So yeah, my name's Sam Brookfield. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the UQ School of Public Health. And so today I'm talking to you about my ethnographic research that I conducted with people experiencing methamphetamine-related harm, and talking a lot about some of the theoretical insights that can be derived from it, leading to a model of recovery that I developed through that research. That's there's a publication forthcoming about it called Extended Recovery. And we'll use a few case studies from some of the participants to sort of illustrate this model. I've done this presentation a couple of times, and I'm starting to become paranoid about people accidentally seeing it twice and hearing me repeat myself. So to keep it fresh, I've been changing out the case studies and using different participants to illustrate the models. So there's some different case studies for today. And just to give everyone a little bit of warning, as I said, this presentation, it can be at quite a theoretical level, using a lot of the participants' quotes and experiences, but we're sort of talking about the concepts and theories that are implicit in how people experience and talk about the world, and the implicit assumptions that are within our policies and some of our treatment models, and thinking about how we can make those implicit theories more coherent, and what kind of services those would support, and how we can make them more effective. So I do my best to translate all of this into some fairly concrete recommendations for practice, but we do stray into some fairly far-flung theoretical territory first, and I hope you'll come with me. So first, rather than any of that, we're going to start in the middle with one of the research participants, which was Jane. So it was September 2018, and I'd gone to visit Jane at her home north of Brisbane. And I'd been to her place a few times, and we were getting to know each other pretty well. And the rain was slowly getting heavier, and as Jane was sort of furiously washing dishes, and I tried to help dry them with an already sodden tea towel. Jane and her partner Ian had started using methamphetamine again frequently, and their relationship was straining under the weight of the disorder and the conflict that could sometimes come with that kind of drug use, alongside the responsibility of caring for their children. Jane was really angry about Ian's behavior, and she felt like they were trapped in a pattern that they couldn't escape. And she was being really hard on herself. At one point, as sort of soap suds flew into the air, she said, "It's how you see yourself, maybe what you think you deserve, because I've been a crap mum, or I think maybe that's all I'm worth, and that's all I deserve as well." What I could see over the months that I spent with Jane and Ian as they moved in and out of drug use, engaging with this research project, with support services, with child safety, with family members, Jane struggled not just with her own drug use or with cravings or with triggers, but a wider social context that decided how she was seen and whether she felt like she was accepted, whether she felt like she could be allowed into the realm of acceptable people, of women or mothers. So the problem of this harmful drug use was in part created and compounded by the social context it occurred in, the structural factors that determined what services she could access, what social supports she had, and thereby how severe the harms were that she experienced. So recovery, which she talked about often, wasn't just a clinical pathway towards abstinence. It was seen as this more multidimensional process of trying to become more socially acceptable or more human. This phrase was Jane's description of how she and Ian were feeling after not using for the following 2 weeks when I went back to see them again. She was commenting on how different their lives were after that short time later. She said, "Yes, we're feeling a bit more human now." Now, in one way, this is a throwaway phrase that any of us might use, but it really got me thinking, like, what do we mean when we say we're becoming more human? Obviously, this definition changes over time, but in our current era, I'd say it arguably describes someone who's moderate, responsible, autonomous, and productive, which is everything Jane thought she wasn't when they were using drugs. So human is what we are when we have agency, when we feel like we're not compelled by substances or by external forces. For Jane and Ian's cycles of drug use and abstinence, of losing and regaining their status as human in their own eyes, it occurred in this context of contemporary Australia, where arguably healthcare is increasingly structured around these concepts of neoliberal sort of paternalism and responsibilization, putting increasing responsibility on the individual. These are frameworks that reinforce this vision of the human as an autonomous, independent, rational, sort of responsible consumer of health services, a template that's implicit in neoliberal policy, in a lot of our public health messaging. And if you want to get into it, it's at a deeper level, it's reflective of concepts of the individual that are pretty fundamental to Western philosophy. These are very old ideas, so they're hard to think outside of. Becoming this kind of human is what's often expected of people when they stop using drugs, to regain their self-control and independence. So by demonstrating these qualities, by engaging with traditional addiction recovery, it can bring social capital as well as clinical and political legitimacy to people that are experiencing stigma and marginalization, people that might feel their humanity threatened. So through my analysis, I'm trying to argue that this threat places an unnecessary burden on people that are already suffering with drug-related harm. And if we can rethink how we've problematized addiction, try and update and expand our ideas of human health, illness, and recovery, we can try and erode this binary distinction between rational, responsible citizens and compulsive drug users, and increase the effectiveness of our policy and interventions and reduce this suffering. So I would argue that one of the issues we have is the significant ongoing theoretical debate over what addiction really is. We have definitions that work well enough, that work well in practice, but in some ways it's more of a case of we know when we see it rather than being able to say accurately what's really going on. And a lot of this boils down to this very widely discussed theoretical issue within drug use literature and research, which is the lack of reconciliation between two key concepts. One, that addiction occurs when an individual loses control over their behavior, and two, addiction can only be resolved when that individual chooses to regain control. And now I would argue that this confusion, it doesn't come about because harmful drug use is anything particularly mysterious, but it comes about as a result of viewing these behaviors within a neoliberal humanist perspective, a perspective that can't account for how non-rational, how not in control we all really are, without even needing to focus on people using drugs. The question of whether people experiencing drug-related harm need external support or external control, or more crudely, treatment versus punishment, it's been at the heart of the debate about drugs for the last 100 years. And so I'm not arguing I'll be able to resolve that here, but what we argue is that a post-humanist framework can provide a path out of this confusion, a path out of these sort of endless debates. Now, post-humanism, it can mean various different things, and it has a kind of weird science fiction ring to it. I promise you it's not a futurist thing. I'm using post-humanism here specifically to describe a school of thought, a way of viewing the everyday world around us that attempts to move beyond some of the basic ideas of traditional humanism. A post-humanist approach questions and disrupts some of these common ideas, like the idea that humanity is made up of autonomous, conscious, discrete individuals, and also the implications that have sometimes followed from this belief, such as that humans represent some kind of center or pinnacle of evolution, always in procession towards a bigger and better future, and that we hold some sort of natural authority over our environment. Posthumanism, alternately, it views the individual as what we call as a nexus of contingent and dynamic relations, embedded and extended through a socio-material environment. So it's viewing the individual as a bundle of relations rather than a node or a unit. Another way of saying this is that the world is not here for our benefit, and there is no higher internal immaterial self to receive that benefit anyway. Now, this is not addiction specific. These are observations that can apply across all of human behavior and experience. But the connection to addiction, and I think the value of applying this to drug use, is that addictive behaviors arguably make this reality unavoidable. It's sort of where the rubber of our illusions meets the road. The rest of the time we can debate whether there's this self that is or not is control, but the indeterminacy of addiction, where people can so acutely experience control and the loss of control, it causes all of the confusion in our attempts to define addiction, and it can therefore lead to a post-humanist conclusion about how best to understand ourselves. So these are a couple of other quotes that sort of illustrate this idea, and this is also sort of acknowledging that these aren't radically new ideas either. This first quote is from Clifford Geertz, who's one of the founders of sort of ethnographic research and the ethnographic method, saying how the Western conception of the person as a bounded, unique, more or less integrated, motivational and cognitive universe, a dynamic center of awareness, emotion, judgment, and action, is, however incorrigible it may seem to us, a rather peculiar idea in the context of the world's cultures. And this is a quote from the book by Richard Davenport Hines about the history of drug use, saying that habitual users of narcotics seldom fit into the bourgeois sense of human identity as a serious business, stable, abiding, and continuous, requiring the assertion of one true, cohesive inner self as proof of health and good citizenry. And so this is just sort of the theoretical basis for the model of extended recovery, which I'm deriving from the research, challenging how the problem of harmful drug use is usually represented as either a failure of individual will or a failure of policy and systems. The argument here is that by examining people's experiences closely, you can show how the process of harmful drug use doesn't strictly conform to either of these frameworks. Human life is more complex than both these paradigms would imply. And so it is phenomena in this sense are emergent, resulting from a diffuse array of factors rather than linear or rational processes. At the same time, extended recovery, it's not intended to be a reinvention of the wheel. There's obviously lots of interventions and policies that are having a really great impact and sort of getting along fine. This is proposed instead more as like a new terminology, a new theoretical framing that can draw together a bunch of ideas that are already out there into a more sort of theoretically coherent approach. So this is why I sometimes talk about it as an attempt to rethink the axle upon which the wheel of recovery is turning, and try and resolve the theoretical confusion that causes so much unnecessary debate. It's saying that if we can straighten out the ideas at the basis of all our interventions, then we can make them more effective. And so with this project, I'm trying to discovering how a post-humanist theoretical landscape could better serve the humans currently suffering under these neoliberal ideas of a responsible, rational, but ultimately atomized and alone citizen. So just a quick point about methamphetamine-related harm. For anyone who's not too familiar with it, I sort of chose to focus on methamphetamine use as it's a real sort of urgent, escalating sort of critical public health issue within Australia. Methamphetamine use-related harm has continued to escalate in Australia over the last decade. There's been increased purity of methamphetamine, increased frequency of use, increased injection, and increased adverse side effects and presentations to services. In Queensland specifically, we had this quite significant statistic of a 17-fold increase in hospital presentations between 2009 and 2014. And we don't have many methamphetamine-specific treatments. And the most evidence-based treatment is still sort of long-term residential rehabilitation. And when that has been studied in the context of methamphetamine use, around 90% of people will continue to return to their previous pattern of use after leaving, which isn't to say those services aren't effective per se, but people are at least requiring multiple presentations and multiple treatment episodes. So it's something where there's increasing harms and our responses to it aren't being maybe as effective as they could be at the moment. And just a quick point on ethnography, for anyone who's unfamiliar with this as a research method. It's a sort of deceptively simple research method. It's based around participant observation. So it's about going out into the world and observing people behaving in their natural environment and in the real world. So I used participant observation and semi-structured interviews. We had a group of 12 people. I followed them each for 6 months. They gave 3 semi-structured interviews across that time. And then I would supplement this with periods of observation, usually focused on activities related to their recovery. So this was going to people's homes, meeting their families, but also going with people to medical appointments, counselling appointments, going to court, going into treatment, going to see child safety, things like that. So yeah, I describe it sometimes as it's described as sociological stalking. You can think about it as stalking somebody with their permission, or yeah, it's the kind of stalking that a human research ethics committee will approve. And I was more specifically trying to do a form of critical ethnography, which is rather than just describing the world as you go out and see it, trying to critique the bodies of knowledge and the systems of power that are producing that world, trying to dig down into what it is that's causing things to be the way they are. And this is just a little overview of all of the participants. Quite a lot of diversity in terms of their trajectory over the course of the project, some with long-term abstinence, some reduced their methamphetamine use, some continued using frequently throughout. Mostly in their 30s and 40s, and most of them had been using methamphetamine since they were quite young, and all of them were accessing some sort of service, regardless of whether their use actually changed. They were all accessing support services and all expressed a desire to either reduce or stop using. And so one of the interesting things you get from this is you see something like recovery is there's so many different orientations to it. These are just a few quotes from a few of the male participants being asked about what they think about recovery as an idea and what about that word. So as Carl says, even though I feel like I've been using every couple of weeks, I still feel like and constantly feel like I'm in recovery. Ian was quite resistant. He says, I believe people have got their opinions. It's their opinion, get on with it. I'm willing to listen to much of it, but once you start dictating to me what I should be doing or how I should be doing, it's going to get my gird up and start getting really nasty. And then Simon, who had achieved some long-term abstinence at the end of the project, he said, I believe recovery is the wrong word in relation to me. I think what's happening to me is I've got a new sense of belonging somewhere else. And maybe I think that's what's been missing. That's what's driving my behavior. And so we don't have time to go through all of the participants today. So we're going to have 2 case studies to focus on. And the first one is Carl. So Carl was in his early 30s. He'd been using methamphetamine intermittently throughout his life since he was introduced to speed by his father when he was 17. And he was still receiving support from some close family members, some close friends. A few years before the project, he'd done a course in teaching English as a second language. He'd taught for a while overseas. And since then, he'd been really wanting to study primary education. That was a goal he still had. He had a few different health issues. He had some fairly sort of poorly controlled epilepsy, and he would talk about this post-seizure depression as a key precipitant for his episodes of drug use. So in one of our interviews, we started talking about his latest episode of drug use and why it happened. And at first he says, just that it was in front of me, and that's all that was. I wasn't strong enough to not asking for some when I could smell it and taste it in the air. And so I said, I suppose you would have known it was going to be in front of you. He said, well, yeah, once I went round and got it for him, I basically pretty much accepted I was going to have some at his place. And I said, so in a way, would that have been a decision when he asked you to get some for him? He said, yeah, it would have been. Before I even actually had it in my hands, I basically made some sort of acceptance in my head that I was going to have just a little bit before he went to his friend's house. So I said, so I guess is the question then, why did you agree to go and get some for him, to get some for your friend? He said, yeah, exactly. There was nothing I was getting out of it. There was no advantage for me. When he called me up and asked me to get him some, straight away, that's what I decided I was getting out of it. It wasn't even really a decision. The decision came as soon as I started sending that text. If I ended up being strong and saying no because I didn't want to make it hard for myself, then the answer would have been straight away no, but it wasn't. So here, Carl is acknowledging many different steps in the process that led up to this episode of drug use. You can see he has trouble saying whether he was in control or not, or when he made any kind of decision to use. He's initially talking about these immediate visceral triggers like sights and smells, but then traces the origin of his behavior to earlier and earlier decisions or actions. And so some of these statements kind of undermine that binary framework of volition and compulsion, of being in or out of control. He says, I basically made some sort of acceptance in my head, or if I ended up being strong. Like being strong, strength of will, people usually talk about it or think about it in more stable terms. And people that do something compulsively are dismissed as being weak-willed. But in the details of experience, we can see these qualities are all much more dynamic and not clearly originating within the self. The discussion then turned to these broader factors that could increase the likelihood of Carl using, and which could also be considered triggers. He says, if I'd still been working every day, I reckon that most likely the answer would have just been no. It would still have been likely, but the reason that it wasn't even a decision is because it was a bit of a perfect storm already. Like I was feeling down in the dumps, and that's often one of my biggest triggers. I definitely could have avoided that situation. So the original trigger that happened beforehand was really what ultimately led to me using. When I was sitting there with the pipe in the room, I put myself there. So it was more so the feeling down in the dumps and just the spare time on my hands and the fact that he wanted me to get him some. So I knew I would get some out of it for free if I wanted. So all them triggers that happened hours before, they were the ones that ultimately led to me using. And so here we can see harmful drug use and then by extension recovery. It's not a fully internal process of decision-making. We might usually think about triggers as things that produce autonomic responses, things that we do without thinking or control, like harmful drug use. But Carl, despite being faced with multiple different triggers, he was able to behave in ways like an autonomous neoliberal individual. He's independently and actively seeking out resources that he valued, while still using methamphetamine in ways that impacted his mental health. And so this complicates these traditional understandings of triggers and how people supposedly lose their rational agency in the context of harmful drug use. He talks about being swept along by this perfect storm. And we can see his decisions can be seen as more of like an emergent product of all these different material factors, like his employment, mental health, access to services, the social network he's embedded in, his contact with friends via text messages, and all of his friends' decisions to use. So he experiences feeling down in the dumps as one of his biggest triggers. And so rather than a linear process of trigger and response in the form of drug use, Carl found himself in this more diffuse triggering environment, some immediate, some delayed, and his recovery required him to navigate this internal and external landscape, not just focus on changing his own thoughts. After visiting the outpatient service where he was recruited to the project, Carl didn't re-engage with any recovery services and started working on a readiness for work course, accessed through his employment services provider. He was also working at a bar, cash in hand, but he lost this job after he appeared intoxicated with methamphetamine when arriving for a shift. And then he later started working for a painter 5 days a week. This regular daytime work helped him maintain abstinence during the week. And so his use initially increased during data collection, but then it reduced to once every 1 or 2 weeks. And so by the end of the project, he was progressing well with his course of study, and he was saving money to try and visit family overseas. And so he said, I feel like I've come a fair way. Like, I'm still in recovery and I've got a long way to go, but I feel like the recovery has come a long way. I said, do you think that's in comparison to the last couple of years? He said, yeah, because my state of mind, putting myself in hospital with self-harm, some pretty serious, pretty life-threatening, that was happening a couple of times every year. I feel like I've deleted that out of my life. So when you compare now to over the last several years, I definitely feel like I've made some ground, that's for sure. Even though sometimes it's frustrating because it doesn't look like that to the other people that care about me. It doesn't look like I'm going so well, but I definitely do feel like I'm making ground. So this quote shows how Carl felt he was making progress despite some ongoing drug use. And this was common for the participants to describe their forms of progress and change and growth in these qualified terms, as if they knew that because they're not engaged in abstinence-only recovery, the progress they felt themselves to be making might not be seen as real or valid. And Carl alluded again to how significant the social setting was for his drug use and how he'd sort of used this against himself to try and reduce the pleasure of drug use. He says, over that whole time, I never let myself have any fun with it. It was always a lonely thing because I didn't let myself fall back into the circles. It would have been funner to use the drugs with other people, but I never let myself do it. And so it turned out to have been a very lonely time when I was lapsing. But I do feel like there was a reason for that. And it was so I wouldn't fall back into those circles. The social embeddedness of drug use and recovery, it meant that many participants' trajectories were powerfully shaped by the people and the environment around them. So Carl's recovery is due in part to his own volition and decisions, but his capacity to make those decisions, the decisions and options available to him, and the consequences of his decisions were all the result of a vast array of external factors. While there was no clear dividing line between what Carl wanted to do and what was imposed upon him through triggers in his environment, there's also no clear line between Carl's self-directed behavior and what was determined by that wider environment. The whole system is acting as one interconnected whole. And so the second case study is Kira, who's also in her 30s, a single mother of 4. Her family had broken down about 4 years previously when her husband was convicted of assaulting one of her daughter's friends. She was using methamphetamine 3 or 4 times a week. She told me how she'd been to rehab twice, but both times she checked herself out to manage issues going on with her teenage son. Kira also used cannabis daily and felt like this had a greater impact on her functioning than methamphetamine. She talked about methamphetamine as like her cup of coffee. She said how she would go to rehab again, but everyone around her, like her kids, her parents, they needed so much from her all the time. And so she felt like the daily chaos of her life was so all-consuming. She didn't have any time to focus on recovery or think about how she could extricate herself from this complex network of relationships and commitments. As she says here, I don't know how to get myself out of, I don't even know what I'm in. So throughout the project, Kira was rejecting the idea of residential rehab because she saw it also as an interruption to her process of negotiating with child safety. She was attending mandatory domestic violence counselling through child safety, which she resented and didn't feel like she got much out of. And she was attending supervised visitation with her daughter. She was also not being regularly drug tested by child safety, not accessing any drug use specific services as part of that process. In the second interview, she talked about the kind of long-term rehabilitation she might consider. She said, if I could take the bub and that and have them in that kind of recovery, however long I'm there for, if I could have them little things, but being kind of restricted and then limited to when I can come out to spend that time, a day on the weekend with them, when I was so close to so much more than that right now. So the way some treatment models can require the sort of extraction and isolation of the individual, it can make those services inaccessible for some people, especially single parents without a lot of supports. For Kira and other single mothers in the project, their caring responsibilities or child safety processes both inhibited their drug use at times, but also prevented them from going to some standard rehabilitation settings. When asked about the word addiction and how she felt about it, Kira said, definitely I have an addiction. Definitely I probably have an addictive personality to certain things. Maybe some people don't like that word because maybe it makes them feel weak. I've never actually thought about that. It's the first time someone's even asked me. I don't know, powerless. Maybe that's why addiction means you're unable to manage your life really in a way. So Kira immediately associates addiction with feeling powerless and identified with it as a label, but she still exercised power and agency over her life in all sorts of ways. She had values that she upheld and goals she was working towards. So these commonplace ideas that a lot of people had of what addiction is, it often sat uneasily alongside people's actual experiences. By the end of the project, Kira had gone from supervised visitation with her youngest daughter to regaining custody, and she'd found her own private accommodation where she was living with her son and daughter. In her final interview, Kira reflected on the previous few months and again emphasized her experiences of growth and change despite her ongoing drug use. She says, even with a little bit of using now, I might high-five myself at the end of the day to get to where I am. It's kind of been a long time coming. It just felt like forever. I can feel that I'm definitely in a better place in my head. I wanted these kids back and I'm going to get them back. And I asked, what is it about what's happened in the last 6 months that makes you want to high-five yourself? She said, it's the relationship building that I've had to do. Even though I've had a good relationship with mum, I've still had to build so much with her. I never saw my small steps, never saw anything moving for a good year at the beginning. This is after her family broke down. It didn't matter if I took 10 steps forward, it didn't show that I took one. Now it's like I can see these steps and each one is just getting a bit bigger each time. And the reward is definitely worth taking the steps forward. While reflecting on the last few months, Kira's highlighting progress in terms of both individual factors like her mental state and relationships and these more structural issues like her practical living situation and child safety. And so without maintaining abstinence during this time, Kira's trajectory had still been towards a stronger position from which to work on her recovery. She viewed her own personal health as secondary to regaining custody of her children. Meanwhile, as she progressively regained responsibility for her children, she fulfilled her goals of securing private accommodation and built these more positive relationships. Her drug use was also having less impact on her life, and she found herself using less. So what I took from all this is that it seemed impossible for Kira to get to a place where she could launch herself out of this web of relationships and access something like long-term rehabilitation, partly because what services she was in contact with either didn't address her drug use or maybe weren't active enough to successfully engage her. I think Kira is an example of where active, persistent, harm reduction-based outreach could really make a big difference, where the service is brought to her in a way that isn't focused on abstinence only and can address the many connections Kira had to her social and family world that were both supporting and inhibiting her recovery. So the experiences of Carl and Kira, they can show how many factors influence drug use and recovery, making it harder to see it as a process occurring within an individual person, just as a result of will or character, but more something distributed throughout the context in which they're living. And so what does this theoretical insight mean for drug services and policy? I would argue that this broader and deeper conception of recovery can go alongside a similarly expanded understanding of disease as applied to harmful drug use. As we know, like other health issues, harmful drug use, it incorporates measurable pathophysiology. That's also shaped by individual choice and overrepresented in certain populations that are subject to different structural factors. So while there's a lot of debate over whether or not it should be called a disease, it shows up very much like other chronic health issues. And this is something covered in one of our publications where we're arguing for an approach that can support people to be living with harmful drug use, if that's what's right for them, similar to how people are increasingly supported to live with heart disease or depression. Obviously, the use of disease terminology, however, it's got a complex and fraught history in the context of drug use. It's sometimes called this a disease of the brain, disease of the will, a social disease. And this question of definition, it's got well-established clinical, social, policy consequences. Because medicalizing something and calling it a disease, it can restrict the agency of the person who has it in a way that, as they say here, serves an essential socio-political purpose. By restricting someone's agency by calling it a disease, some people argue it can make people who use drugs be seen as more worthy recipients of compassion and of treatment. Also, if we treat drug use as categorically different to other chronic health issues, this can also be marginalizing because it can exclude that population from the social and practical resources that we allocate to managing all these other health issues. If addiction is somehow completely different to other chronic health issues, then we risk enshrining it as this sort of disembodied and only psychological and therefore also criminalized characteristic. So despite its complex past, I think we can still argue for an effort to reclaim and importantly redefine the terminology of disease for some forms of harmful drug use in order to understand how health and illness, they extend beyond the individuals that are usually the focus of treatment and policy. Disease terminology could still meaningfully address the health impacts of harmful drug use, but obviously a reductionist like brain disease paradigm is patently insufficient for describing what's going on. So if harmful drug use isn't a disease of the brain, what is it a disease of? Coming back to a post-humanist perspective, we would say the disease is of the network within and around the individual. And that disease state arises from this much broader conception of what people are and how their behavior emerges. It's not an individual factor or a structural factor, it's both and. And this is a quote from a sociologist, Darren Weinberg, who's done a lot of stuff applying posthumanism to drug use. He says, as a posthumanist, I regard diseases not merely as pathological biological mechanisms, but more generally as patterns of harmful bodily articulation, patterns with which we cannot or do not want to identify ourselves because they afflict or endanger those with which we do self-identify. So if we're clear that this is what is meant by disease, then I can see no reason to deny and every reason to affirm that an addiction might be just such a thing. So if it goes along with a reevaluation of what a disease is, then there can be a way to use this language. This extended recovery model, it also draws on the language of extended health, which is a similar related idea. It's drawing on convergent evidence from a bunch of different fields, which are arguing for an increased focus on similarities and symbiosis between human health, animal health, ecological health, these different these different layers. With extended health, Moore and Skolberg, the proponents of it, they're talking about occupying this important middle ground between traditional models that look at the internal workings of an individual and sort of like global health, things that are too broad. Trying to find that middle ground of relational, familial, social units. So extended recovery, it's a form of recovery. It's not necessarily extended in time, it's extended in space. It's seeing recovery as emerging from a thick web of intertangled forces, the way an individual tree emerges from a vast and complex root structure. Some of this is implicit in another statement from Simon, one of the participants. He paused during one interview. He said, "So I'm sorry, I'm just thinking a lot in my head. Of course, where else would you think?" And so I think extended recovery can kind of be seen as an answer to this question. Our thoughts are produced and therefore are happening far beyond our own heads. And we need to start thinking about human thought, behavior, health more explicitly in this way. So we've got 4 initial recommendations that could be derived from an extended recovery model. The first is for a primarily theoretical change towards approaching harmful drug use as a multidimensional and integrated process, even sometimes as a disease, rather than only a product of structural forces or individual pathology. This multidimensional approach could be supported by a more informed and nuanced understanding of agency, not as just a quality of individuals, but a conventional term for these emergent effects. This model can help diffuse the constant debate around choice and personal responsibility of people who use drugs and help prevent moralistic and punitive understandings from shaping our policy and our funding decisions. The concepts of extended recovery could thereby help create the ideological space for a wider conversation about social determinants of other physical, psychological diagnoses and how addiction is a typical case of ill health rather than an unusual case of complexity when it comes to humans and health behaviors. The second recommendation is for services to provide models of care that emphasize family, social networks, and communities rather than individuals or populations, focusing on these larger relational units that are that middle ground they talk about in extended health. So recovery extends to partners, friends, children, others in the lives of people using drugs that they're in relationship with. Framing recovery this way can acknowledge the value that people who use drugs provide to those around them, while also requiring support themselves. Number three, an extended recovery model acknowledges the chronic nature of something like drug-related harm, moving away from short-term strategies that necessitate abstinence. Abstinence-focused acute care programs are important. They do help many people, but people who use drugs are a large and heterogeneous group. So frameworks need to allow for the values of different groups that prioritize harm reduction over abstinence. It's going to be less likely to exacerbate stigma and more effective at reducing harm. And four, an extended recovery model is going to have a more diverse understanding of recovery trajectories, validating the forms of change, progress, and growth that people can experience without necessarily being abstinent from drugs. For a lot of the participants, their recovery extended outside of their periods of abstinence. It's something they were always working on. And so acknowledging this, we can further reduce stigma and empower people to find success through their own self-defined trajectories. So in conclusion, if we want, some harmful drug use can be viewed as a disease, but if this is a disease occurring in an extended body, it incorporates multiple social and environmental aspects, leading to an emergent effect of what we call addiction. By emphasizing the ways we're all continuous with the people and the environment around us and not drawing categorical lines between people who use drugs and everyone else, an extended recovery model could be demarginalizing for people experiencing drug-related harm. A post-humanist approach that views health, disease, and agency as distributed and contingent can lead to frameworks for intervention that are ultimately humanizing by recognizing that effective ways of reducing these harms aren't focused on just treating amoral or pathological individuals. Extended recovery is based on a non-judgmental, non-moralizing, but assertive strategies that address the social and familial context that people are embedded in. And so this approach could thereby reduce the threat to people who use drugs of losing their humanity in the eyes of society or themselves, and relieve them of the challenge to become more human through narrow and predetermined trajectories of recovery. In her final interview, some months after the washing up tirade, Jane tearfully concluded that this is just a disease and something I have to fight for every day. As long as I keep trying, hopefully one day I'll get it right. While Jane allocated herself sole responsibility for one day getting it right, in practice, her trajectory was extended through her relationship with Ian, his drug use, their children, clinicians, and others. By providing policies and models of care that recognize this, based in a post-humanist framework, we may be able to reassure Jane that, contrary to her original assertion, she had been human all along. And this is just to know, these are the four papers we've had come from this study so far. I've got a paper hopefully forthcoming that's based around the extended recovery model. If anyone would like to ask any questions or read any of these, please do get in touch. And I'd like to thank all of the participants who gave so much time and energy to the project, my advisory team, and also the Queensland Injectors Health Network that provided a community advisory group throughout the project that was very valuable. And that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sam, thank you so much. I don't know about that being all. It sounds like this is continuing to build on a great amount of work and, I guess, narrative in this area that, for myself as someone who's been in this field for a long time, starting to kind of really put a great language and story around things that we have seen shift in the sector slowly, very slowly, but certainly all those things you're talking about, I very simplistically sum it up in my own head about where, when I began in this field, you know, it was all about the drug and it was all about the person. And over time, different researchers building all on a great, you know, kind of, as he was talking about there, so much more to consider in terms of the context and to get shared meaning and understanding with people. So we've had some questions come through. I've certainly got a few buzzing around my own brain, but just to pay respect to those who've given their time and input. Got a question here from Deb asking about, and you may be seeing these on your screen and probably reading it faster than me. You obviously spoke to participants and you shared generously from those conversations, but also when you spoke to families, did you include the client or speak separately to them away from the client? And how did the subjects, as in the people who are experiencing the methamphetamine-related harm of the project, respond to you wanting to speak to their families? What sort of questions did you ask? I'm just trying to understand from those questions to what extent shame can come up and fear from clients past burnt bridges with family, etc. If you did, or if you didn't.
Good question. I think the nature of the data collection, it was different with each participant, depending on what their life was like and what they were happy with or what they would consent to. I think importantly, each participant, my relationship was initiated first just with them. I would do the interview with them and get to know them first, and then with most of them, I would sort of meet their families with them. So I might be going around their house to see them, and their family were there, and they're just sort of talking together. There were only a couple of times that I explicitly spoke to family members without the participant there, and that was obviously after first discussing with the participant and them giving consent for it. And it was often just to get more context and another person's perspective, and it was normally decided on just how important this person was in the participant's life, their real key support person for them. Then that's why I would sort of talk to them as well. But a lot of the time with meeting people's families, it was more observation. Most of it was watching them interacting with each other and watching their home life rather than sort of interviewing the other family members specifically.
That's great. Thank you, Sam. Just a question here about the copy of those articles. Is that people contacting you directly by the information on the screen there?
I guess that's easiest. I mean, they're all available. I think a couple of them might be open access, or they're available if you have access to university database. But if not, just send me an email and I'll distribute PDFs freely.
No worries. Thanks for that. And lots of comments here about great work, Sam. So I'm sure you're seeing those, but just to acknowledge them as well. Do you have any suggestions on how to broach the concept with clients in plain language? For example, when they are self-blaming and so focused on themselves, how can we explain it goes beyond them? A lot of our audience is probably people who are on the front line and thinking about those sorts of things. I mean, this is something I know I've come across a lot in practice as well. So,
I think in a lot of ways, this is sort of the next stage for this work, to try to translate into these even more concrete and lower scale strategies and interventions. I think if when someone's in that state of blaming themselves, it's difficult, because part of how this is difficult is you're wanting to shore up their sense of agency and their sense of ability to make changes now, while without sort of building up their sense of responsibility and self-blame for behaviors that they maybe sort of don't identify with. I think some of this framework is not necessarily something that you put out in that kind of one-on-one interaction as well. I think in that sort of situation, I think it's about focusing on what we do next, focusing on the present moment, focusing on separating themselves from the behaviors they've done in the past because of all the things that they would have arisen from at that time. I think allowing people to separate themselves from their own behaviors and not identify with all of them all of the time. That's probably the most direct strategy that comes to mind now that you could say is fits very well within a post-humanist framework, that people don't allow their identity to sort of escalate and build up and get wrapped around these behaviors that they might regret or not want to identify with.
No, thank you for that. And we've got a lovely reflection here from Julie, that thanking you for helping to shift her thinking. I've come from the old paradigm. I think I've worked in the old paradigm, Julie, with not a lot of user experience since the meth explosion. I've avoided such clients where possible by redirecting them. I really like the systems thinking. And thank you for that. That's lovely to share. And I guess on that, picking up on that theme of systems thinking there, Sam, I guess a question from me is that you touched a lot of points of contact in people's lives, and you spoke about the axle before, about some of and the idea of extended recovery. My thought is, what's your views on, does that recovery that idea of treatment or recovery need to extend beyond just the people who are experiencing the harm in terms of what we classically think of treatment? Do we need more interventions for all these other contact points around people to help them to be able to respond better or understand things and change some of the stuff that's happened, turning on their wheel?
Yes, definitely. I think that would be a agenda of work that could follow very directly from this kind of a framework. I think that would be based on the idea that if there is a problem here, if there's harms occurring, or there's things we want to change, that doesn't originate solely within this one individual. It's emerged from this whole network that they're embedded in. And so wherever possible, if the intervention can address that broader framework, support the people that are supporting the individual, then yeah, I think it's definitely going to be more effective. And also, I think treating people treating families as units, rather than requiring the individual to leave their whole environment. And and obviously the whole field of family therapy and etc. This is all very well established ideas, but I think the goal here is to try to have them all plugged into the one coherent framework.
And that is an area, I mean, certainly nowhere near perfect, but to me, these are some of the paradigm shifts that have been happening in the alcohol and drug sector, is things like that kind of family inclusive practice is growing, still needs a lot of work, but there are those evidence things. The approach of, it's not quite exactly what you're talking about, but to me, there's slow shifts where we've moved more towards models that look at that biopsychosocial, and also extending that now to the idea of cultural and systemic kind of factors, and considering all of that when doing our kind of looking at the story and understanding a person's journey and experience. I say these things not that they are there yet or fully baked. Yeah, they are, things that are slowly shifted. And I reflect from where I began, where it was all about that kind of very much focused on the individual and the deficits of the individual. Things are slowly moving, slowly shifting. So thank you for adding to the critical mass of evidence and ways that we can build on that. And that's a reflection here that's also come, a lovely one that hopefully you're seeing on your screen as well, to thank you for sharing your thoughts, the fresh perspective to a complex subject, being very informative and rich for those who are working in the mental health and alcohol and other drug field. Nothing to add from this, our contributor today, but yeah, a little bit like me, and I hope others wanting to digest these materials, to think about how it does translate into where we are meeting people and sitting across from them, whether that be individuals, their families, and their loved ones. Because I'd like to come back to the material if I have access to them. And I think Sam's mentioned before there, and the details we've kept up on the screen of how to make contact in terms of email addresses and websites and other contact details. I love the reflection here and the nice extension of that: extended recovery, extended belonging. That idea, I guess, a lot about connections, meaningful connections in people's lives across systems. But also, I think what your research is telling us, Sam, and tell me if I've got it wrong, it's also about this. Our systems need to actually make meaningful connections with people who are experiencing methamphetamine-related harm. It's not a one-way street. Is some of the messaging I'm picking up from this?
It's I think having a more sort of empowering approach to not telling people how they need to live or how they need to change, but acknowledging the different values and goals people have and just supporting them to achieve those however they want to achieve them. So you have, make that more meaningful contact.
Yeah, and that shared meaning making around, well, what does recovery mean for you? What does that look like? All those things that so easily we can kind of slip into a language that we don't and make a lot of assumptions and simplistic kind of conclusions from that. So look, a lot to go on here, and thank you for, first of all, Sam, and again, a lot of other things there that are really kind of just pointing out how you've made people think. I think that's always just a great outcome from these types of discussions. Thank you for generously sharing what's been a lot of very detailed and in-depth work on to give voice to a lot of perspectives that we can so easily overlook or just just see things in a very simplistic way and not in context. So that's deeply appreciated. And also for spending some time to hang around to answer some questions after that, and for allowing people to be able to access your materials, data of you and your colleagues that you've directed us to. So I'd encourage everyone to approach Sam who would like to read things, because I think to digest this type of information, we need to go back over and look at some of those things that are translated more in written word to help us understand. So really appreciate that.